Mark chapter 1, verse 21, it says, "And they passed along into Capernaum, and entering into the synagogue, and at once he taught on the Sabbath." Right now we're standing in that synagogue. Actually, it's a synagogue that was built on top of the one that Jesus would have taught in, but it's at the exact location. And of course, Jesus was born in Bethlehem, was raised in Nazareth, not too far from here, and then when was released by the Father at the age of 30, came and began to move in his ministry in this region, in Galilee. Galilee means circle of the nations, or circle of the heathen. And in this region, and especially in this location, in the synagogue, Jesus did much of his teaching. He, of course, was in Jerusalem often teaching and preaching in the temple, but a lot of Jesus' power ministry occurred here in this location. It's here where he spoke about the bread of life in John 6. It's here where he cast out an unclean spirit in this location, in the synagogue. So it was much of Jesus' power ministry occurred in this region, and much of his teaching when he was up in Capernaum was from this location, from this synagogue. And it says in Mark 1:22 that he was teaching them as having authority and not as the scribes. And when the Lord was released, finally, after living in Nazareth for 30 years by the Father, and released into his ministry, he began to move, of course, in what it was that he was called to do. And when he began to teach in these different places, especially up here in this region, people were amazed at his teaching, because his teaching was much different than any other teaching they had ever heard of, because he taught as one who had authority, because he was and is the Son of God. And again, when he was in this region, he moved in power. There were many, many powerful miracles that Jesus began to perform, or the Father was working through him. And it says in Scripture that his fame went out into the region, even up into Syria, not far from here. So this is where Jesus his name began to become, if you would, famous. The Father began to spread his name through the region from this area. And it goes on to say in Mark 1:23, "A man with an unclean spirit was in their synagogue. And he cried out, saying, 'What is to us and to you, Jesus Nazarene? Have you come to destroy us? I know you, who you are, the Holy One of God.' And Jesus rebuked him, saying, 'Be quiet, come out of him.' And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, it came out of him. And all were astonished, so as to discuss to themselves, saying, 'Who is this? What new teaching is this, that he commands even the unclean spirits with authority, and they obey him?' And his fame went out at once into all the Galilean neighborhood." This is something that was unheard of until that time. You have to remember that the religious sects in this nation, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they did not cast out demons. They didn't have the authority to do that. There were 7 sons of Sceva, a priest, that's recorded in Acts, who tried to do these things, and it says that as they tried to do this, the young man with the unclean spirit jumped on them and beat them, the 7 sons of Sceva. But Jesus came in the authority of the Father, and he had the authority to do these things. They began to move in this, and people could see that this wasn't like anything that they had seen before, heard before. See, religion has a form of godliness, but it says it denies the power therein. But Jesus, he had no form of comeliness. There was no form of religion to Jesus. If you saw Jesus walking, you would not see any religiosity on him, but there was a reality in him. He was full of the power of God, and he moved in that power, and people were seeing this and saying, "What is this? What kind of teaching is this? What's going on here? We've not seen this before." And it's no different today than it was then. You know, religion has a form of godliness, but it doesn't have power to set people free. It's just a form. It's just ceremony. It's just religion. But see, when you come into a relationship with the Lord and begin to move in his realm, the kingdom of God, The word says the kingdom of God is not a matter of talk. It's a matter of power. And religion is a matter of talk. But the kingdom of God is a matter of power. That's why when Jesus came, he came preaching the kingdom, it says. That's when he started preaching. The kingdom of God was here. The kingdom of God is here, he said. And he began to preach that gospel here in this region. And the people that were up here, this is where he found Peter and Andrew and James and John. We're not far from the Sea of Galilee. Actually, I can see it right now. And he called them from their nets. They were from this area. And they began to follow him. But Jesus was bringing a whole new dynamic in this land. He was bringing the kingdom. And that's why John the Baptist came as a forerunner to him, preaching the same gospel. The kingdom of God is here. It's here. It's here now. The kingdom has always existed because wherever God is where the kingdom is. And the Lord began to move in his power. And people didn't quite understand what was going on, but they could see that something was different. Something was different about this man and what he was doing. That was different than what they were used to. And it's no different today. Again, there's so many different sects, denominations, all these different things that really just bring confusion. But what you need to look for is authority from God. You need to look at, if there's no authority, there's no sanction from God. Authority is the basis by which God stamps something with his authority. And Jesus came in the authority of the Father, in the authority of the kingdom. And what he moved in was power. So in the synagogue, a man came in, he had an unclean spirit. He had an evil spirit. And he cried out. And Jesus wasn't nervous or intimidated by that. He rebuked it. He said, "Be quiet and come out of him." And it did. It came out of the man. And this was the beginning of the Lord moving in power. And there's no difference between what was happening then and today. That same spirit that operated and functioned through Jesus, if you know him, that same spirit lives in you. That's why we can function, if it's in faith, the same way that Jesus did. He said, "Greater things than these shall you do, because I'm going to the Father." So he has given us, if you know him, the Holy Spirit, and we can move in the same power, the dunamis, the dynamite of God, to move in a way that Jesus did in order to dispel darkness, in order to kick out, if you would, out of people's lives the enemy that doesn't belong there. And that's what Jesus did that day that he was in the synagogue. He basically kicked out a demon that was in this man that didn't belong there. And it's the same thing today. The Lord is moving in that way, and he wants to move even in a greater capacity in that way in his church. And again, this is the beginning of his ministry, this location. Later, we're going to be going down onto the Sea of Galilee, of course, where Jesus spent time there, called his disciples from. But it's very interesting that it was, every step of the Lord was ordered by the Father. And for him to live 30 years, in some aspects contained in Nazareth, he was probably like a horse in a gate wanting to get out. Even when he was 12, he was in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, and he stayed behind. And his parents had to come and see it and find him. He said, "Didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business?" But he was 12. He came back and submitted to the Father until he was 30. And then the Father released him. And he really was ordered by the Father and waited for the right time. And at the time he came here, and that's when the power of God began to move through him, and it would permeate throughout this whole land. Till next time, God bless you.